If this is the best Russia can do after a year of wider fighting in Ukraine, its ballyhood winter offensive could be costly and brief. Okay, so I want to talk to you guys about a failed Russian winter offensive. Everybody has been talking about the battle for Bakhmut, and it looks like the Ukrainian positions in Bakhmut are going to become more and more difficult to hold as time goes on, as the routes into it are getting more constantly shelled, as the defenders there are being put under more and more pressure. It's extremely costly for the Russians, but a lot of analysts that I'm talking to are giving me the impression that it might make more sense for the Ukrainians to withdraw earlier rather than later, so they can withdraw on their own terms, since Bakhmut isn't like, I don't know, a supply hub. It isn't a major location that is extremely important for the war effort. Its main usefulness for the Russians is going to be as a stepping stone towards trying to take the rest of the Donbass, namely locations like Kramatorsk, which are going to be much more difficult to take since, you know, Bakhmut's like a city of what, like 12 to 15,000 people. Kramatorsk is a city of 100,000 people. So them taking that later on is probably going to be more difficult. And they need Bakhmut if they're going to be able to take Kramatorsk. They could try to do it without Bakhmut, but it's going to be very difficult. And so, but that doesn't mean that's the only place the Russians are attacking. And they're having trouble there, but they seem to have a lot more trouble a little bit south of Bakhmut. If you look at this map right here, we'll do map time later. Just stop. Let me do my segment. If you look at this map right here, Bakhmut is up here in this area, right? Now, to the south down here, this is like we're getting near the Zaporozhye front line. We're, you know, closer to the city of Donetsk, a little bit south to it. The Russians tried a major offensive in Volodya. I don't know how to ever pronounce it correctly. Very sorry. Their goal was to capture this so it'd be more difficult to protect all of these positions to the north, like Marinka and all these other locations. Then you would have the Ukrainians have to pull back. The front line over here would be more difficult to hold, and it would help the Russians all along the Donbass front line, all the way up to Bakhmut up here. So, keeping that in mind, the Russians sent a bunch of tanks. I mean, dozens of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and all this other stuff towards this location in order to take it. And they used the exhaust from the vehicles as a smokescreen in an attempt to take this little city, village, town, whatever you want to call it. It's not like Kiev or anything, but it's somewhat sizable. About 12,000 people live there. Oh, well, that's the pre-war population right now. I don't know the exact amount of people. I assume it's much less than what it was before. Anyway, this did not go very well for the Russians due to a host of factors. The fact that the soldiers that were attacking bunched up, due to possibly a lack in combat experience, due to the fact that the Ukrainians already had the artillery positioning and like they already kind of like, I don't know the word geolocated is the right word, but they already calculated where they need to fire their artillery in advance. Because before battles, a lot of times militaries will pre-calculate like what the exact coordinates of different spots on the map are so they can fire in advance and they don't have to spend that time when the battle starts trying to calculate where their artillery needs to go. So they pre-calculated that in advance. They had drones, they had mines, and it ended up being a slaughterhouse for the Russians, to put it lightly. In fact, here are some pictures of the wreckage after the Russians tried to take it. There are 31 vehicles as of right now that have been identified destroyed during this offensive. Here are all these pictures of all these vehicles that have been destroyed. I mean, it is a lot, like a lot of pictures of just destroyed and burnt out tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and all types of military equipment was destroyed in this offensive. And I wanted to read the article about this because it wasn't even that close. And Forbes wrote a piece about it, and I wanted to read why they thought the Russians failed so drastically here. Russia's widely anticipated winter offensive has begun. Aiming to extend its control over the eastern Ukraine Donbass region, Russian troops are attacking north and south of Donetsk city. In the northern sector, around the city of Bakhmut, the Russians are slowly advancing, albeit at staggering costs. In the south, around Volodya, the Russians' losses are just as steep, but they've made no clear gains that can justify the casualties. This is turning into a meat grinder for the Russian army, with enormous implications for the winter offensive. The latest Russian attack on the town, with a pre-war population of around 14,000 that lies a mile north of Russian-held Pavlinka, 25 miles south of Donetsk, kicked off Monday. Seemingly a couple of battalions of Russian mechanized troops, together riding in a few dozen T-80 tanks, BMP-1s, and BMP-2 fighting vehicles, advanced north. T-80s are, you're getting like closer to the, it's not like a ton more advanced than T-72s, but it is better than T-72s and certainly better than T-62s. It's one of the better tanks. It's not a T-90, but it's on the upper end of the spectrum for Russian tanks. The Ukrainian army's elite 72nd Mechanized Brigade is entrenched there. It has laid minefields along the main approaches, and its drones surveil the front. Its artillery is dialed in. The Russians know this, and the assault force took rudimentary precautions. Tank crews injected fuel into their exhaust to produce smoke screens. At least one T-80 carried a mine plow. But leadership and intelligence failures and Ukrainian superior artillery fire control neutralized these measures. The Russian formation rolled into dense minefields, destroyed tanks, and BMPs blocked the advance. Vehicles attempting to skirt the ruined hulks themselves ran into mines. Panicky vehicle commanders crowded so tightly behind the smoke-generated tanks that Ukrainian artillery, cued by drones, could score hits by firing at the head of the smoke. The Russians' day-long attack ended in heavy losses and retreat. The survivors left behind around 30 wrecked tanks and BMPs. This is further evidence of the downward spiral in Russian military effectiveness. Armies that lacked robust recruitment, training, and an industrial base tend to become steadily less effective as losses deepen. Desperate to maintain the pace of operations, the army replaces any well-trained, well-equipped troops who've been hurt or killed with an equal number of new recruits. But without taking the time or expending the resources to train and equip those new recruits, troops to the previous standard. So the army gets less and less competent, even as it indicates more and more new personnel. Inducts more and more new personnel. Incompetence leads to even greater loss, which prompts the army to double down, draft more green troops, train them even less, and hurry them to the front even faster than it did with previous recruits. Apply this tragic model here, and the Russian army's failure make more sense. For months, the Russian Marine Corps' 155th and 40th Naval Infantry Brigade were responsible for the sector around here, but the Marines suffered devastating losses in repeated failed assaults during last fall. It's possible both Marine brigades are now combat ineffective. The replacement appears to be the 72nd Motor Rifle Brigade, a new and inexperienced formation that belongs to the ill-fated 3rd Army Corps. The 72nd MRB formed in Russian Tatarstan, and as such includes a high proportion of ethnic minorities. Cannon fodder to the Kremlin. Damn, Forbes going off. Outside of Volodya, the Russian 72nd Brigade met the Ukrainian 72nd Brigade and got beaten at least as badly as the Marine Brigade did. If this is the best Russia can do after a year of wider fighting in Ukraine, its ballyhood winter offensive could be costly and brief. Okay, so what do I think of this? Well, what I think is not necessarily, now, this is just one story, right? While this is a disastrous offensive for the Russians, I mean, losing over 30 vehicles in one day in one battle is very, very bad. Very bad. While I do want to highlight this, I do want to also say that it's not like this in every city and every village and every town around the country. There are a lot of other locations where the Russians are more successful. Now, I'm not saying they're taking village after village after village very quickly, but they're grinding down these villages before taking them slowly at high costs. Not in such disastrous offensives there, but in more grinding slug fights as they shell each other until one of them breaks and has to pull out. So I do want to emphasize that before I talk about the implications that the Forbes article brings up. The downward spiral that Forbes describes here is most likely only going to get worse as time goes on. Russia has been mobilizing more and more and more people, and that has led to some armchair commentators talking about, hey, with more and more and more people, obviously that means Russia now can use all these more and more and more people to just win battle after battle after battle. But what a lot of people are not taking into consideration is how poorly equipped a lot of those soldiers are, with many of them only having 1 or 2 magazines of ammunition. A lot of them not having medical equipment, not having first aid and medical gear. We saw those videos of Russian trainers, Russian commanders telling soldiers that if they can't get medical gear because they're all bought up or they're too expensive, just go get tampons and use those tampons to plug up wounds. We've also then found tampons on the bodies of dead Russian soldiers, men, not women, indicating again that, you know, they can't get proper medical equipment. We've seen the rusty AKs, we've seen the decrepit tanks and armored vehicles they're dragging out of storage that have been stored for, what, like 50, 60 years? And this is all on top of the fact that these soldiers are not getting top-tier military training. These guys aren't getting 3 to 4 to 5 months in order to prepare for the hell they're going to walk into, to go die in these trenches across the Ukrainian nation. They're getting like a month, maybe 2 of training. And that's if they're on the higher end. That's if they're lucky. We've actually read reports of soldiers only getting weeks of training. The Russian mindset around this is, well, if this guy's just going to be driving trucks or this guy's just going to be moving logistics around, they don't need to know all the ins and outs of combat. But a lot of these guys aren't just driving trucks. A lot of these guys aren't just moving logistics around. And even if that is the case, eventually they still need to know how to properly use a gun and properly fight. Many of these soldiers are being sent to the front line. And every time they do this, every time they train a soldier poorly, the odds that that guy goes back home in a coffin increases. The less time you give them to train, the worse equipment you give them, the higher the likelihood that this guy's going to go home in a coffin, and then you're going to replace him with somebody else. And you're going to, even in a more rapid pace, try to rush them to the front, try to get them training as quick as possible, get them equipment, even if it isn't top tier, and send them to the front, which is going to slowly and slowly and slowly, I don't know how slowly. I'm emphasizing how slow it is, but we've seen this process really happen quite rapidly, really. We're going to see the quality of the Russian military continue to degrade, and the possibility of seeing more fights like this continues to increase. And we've been seeing fights like this since the beginning of the war, since the Kiev offensive. We've seen half of the tanks that Russia started with, around 1,500 tanks at least, get destroyed by the Ukrainian army. Well, 1,000 destroyed, 500 captured. Still, basically same difference. Only difference is now, if they're captured, there's a decent chance the Ukrainians could actually use that for themselves and repurpose it to fight the Russians. The more that happens, the more you have disasters like this, the worse it's going to get. And so while a lot of people talk about the idea that, you know, Russia has a kind of endless population supply, which isn't true, but they have a big population, they can kind of do this forever, the margins in which their soldiers are going to be dying could continue to increase as the quality of their soldiers continue to go down and they don't know what they're doing. This has been true of every war in human history. World War I, World War II, the new green troops that get sent to the front die at a much higher rate than the troops that have been there for a while, that are experienced, that have better training and have better equipment. It's a basic and pretty understandable part of war. And I just wanted to show this as kind of a microcosm of the problem that Russia is going to be facing as they get deeper and deeper into this war, as this war that they only planned to really last a week ends up possibly lasting years. I don't know how sustainable that is. They have a lot of soldiers to throw at the front. Well, actually, no. They don't have a lot of soldiers to front of the front. They have a lot of men to throw at the front. They don't have a lot of soldiers to throw at the front.